Hello. Today we will continue. So, to this dear companion of ours, the book, Tales of the Soul's Conquest of Evil. We have finished the Arthurian cycle, and now we are going to delve into a very special story. The King and the Corpse. As I mentioned to you on another occasion, the book originally has this name, and it took on the subtitle Tales of the Soul's Conquest of Evil when it was translated into other languages. The book had this name precisely because this is the main story. A story so rich in meanings, it's almost a bit overwhelming, because not two words go by without conveying some information. Precious, of course, we will take an approach that is not. Don't think I'm going to unravel the secrets of this story. Who am I? Let's point out some possibilities. We won't exhaust the subject, nor would that be possible. I will talk a little about Zimmer interpretations in the book and my own added interpretations, so that we can come away with some element that can serve us in life. I find it very difficult to go through a story like this without it leaving a deep mark on us. In fact, it's part of the story itself. In the end, the very specter that participates is the central character. In the tale, he says that those who remember these stories and read them with faith and devotion will always gain some power over circumstances. It's not a paranormal power from someone coming to help us, but an internal power that awakens when we understand a little better how life works. Well, the story of this king is said to be about a king who actually existed in the 2nd century before Christ. It's an Indian story. What might have happened to King Vikramaditya, who is considered an incredibly wise king? In fact, there are several other stories about him. He was a very beloved king. He would constantly hold court, receiving the people in his throne room, as every king does. And every day, without fail, for 10 years, a man dressed in the robes of a mendicant, like a monk, would enter. And he would hand him a simple fruit. He found it so bizarre, the man asked for nothing, said nothing, just handed over the fruit and left. The king would take that fruit, such an insignificant gift, and hand it to his treasurer, who stood behind him. The treasurer didn't even bother to keep it, just to throw it away. Then he would throw it himself out of the window at the back of the hall. And this went on for 10 years. 10 long years, every single day. On a certain day, the king had a variety of animals within the castle, including some little monkeys. One day, a little monkey enters the throne room. When the king receives that fruit, the monkey grabs it from the king, starts nibbling on it, trying to eat it, and splits it in half. When it splits in half, a precious gem of immense value, a jewel, falls out from inside. The king is very surprised by this, and he asks the treasurer to go check the other fruits. What he did with the other fruits. The treasurer says, I threw everything out the window. When they go down there, they realize that among a pile of semi-rotten fruits, some completely decayed, there was a series of Cruz y Souza jewels given over those 10 years. Inside each fruit, there was a jewel. And the king, then, becomes curious to understand what this is all about. Who is that mendicant, and what did he intend with such precious gifts that are only now being revealed? So, the next day, he goes. When this mendicant appears with the fruit, the king goes to meet him and talks to him. What he had discovered about the jewels and how he could repay such a precious gift, what the mendicant expected from him. The mendicant says he was called, even known as, the one endowed with great patience. Rich in patience. And this ascetic tells him to meet, the king should meet him that night, in a field that was near the city. It was a field where the city's dead were cremated, and in the background there was a place where criminals were hanged. In other words, a rather gloomy place to visit at night. But the king agreed. At night, he put on his cloak so as not to be recognized. He took his own. The priest went alone to meet this ascetic. When he arrived there, he found him drawing a circle on the ground. And this circle, a magic circle, He was crafting with all the details. He turns to the king without much attention and says, "You will have to cross this field, go to the place where the criminals are hanged, and look for a body that is at the far end of this field, hanging from a tree. Take him down from the tree and carry him back here." The king doesn't question much. If that's what needs to be done, he goes and does it. He walks to the back of the field, finds a body hanging from a tree, climbs the tree, cuts the rope from which the body was hanging, and when the body falls to the ground, it lets out a laugh. He is startled. Could this man still be alive? When he goes there, he sees, no, it really is a dead body. There must be some ghost inside him, and he asks the body, "Why did you laugh?" Automatically, when he asks this question, the body returns to the tree and hangs itself again on the tree. The rope reappears, and he is hanging from the tree again. The king understands, so I can't talk to him. I mustn't talk to him. He goes there, climbs up, cuts the rope again, puts the corpse on his back, and starts walking. Then the corpse starts to speak to him. Evidently, there was a specter inside, a spirit of some kind. And the corpse says, "Look, can I tell you a story to make your long walk a bit more pleasant?" The king doesn't say anything. He says, "Look, I'm going to tell you a story. If you know the answer and don't give it to me, your head will explode." And he begins to tell the first of a series of quite curious stories. The first story he is going to tell is the story of two young men and a lady. He says, "There was once a prince who went to the river bank with a young man who accompanied him, who was the son of the king's advisor, his inseparable companion, whose mission was to protect him. The two were at the river bank when they saw on the other side of the river, relatively far away, a young woman trying to communicate with the prince through gestures. The prince doesn't understand any of it, but the advisor does. Very shrewd, he understands. And he says she is saying that her name is such and such, that she lives in such and such a place, and that she is in love with him. For your majesty." The prince is very surprised by this. She was a beautiful young woman. The next day, they set out again with the hunters, moving away and heading to the part of the kingdom where that young woman lived. Upon arriving there, they ask a lady to deliver a note to her. She responds to this note through riddles, so that the lady carrying it wouldn't understand. When the lady arrives with this encrypted note, the prince doesn't understand a thing. But his advisor, once again, deciphers it. She tells him the time he should stealthily enter the house where she lived, very well protected by her parents, who didn't want anyone to have contact with her. They wanted to protect her in every way, and he should enter through the window of the tower where she lived to meet her. And so he does. He goes there at that time, manages to outsmart. She was very well guarded, but he manages to outsmart the watch. He enters, climbs through the window, and the two meet and exchange vows of love. But this young woman becomes a bit puzzled because she realizes that the prince hadn't understood any of her messages. It was the advisor who had understood. She fears that this advisor might betray her. She reports what was happening to her parents, that this would be her downfall. And then she has an idea. She comes up with the idea to kill this advisor. The advisor, who was very clever, realizes that she would logically think that. He, while wanting to help the prince in the pursuit of his love, also wishes to protect the prince from being eventually discovered. And then he calls the prince and devises a scheme. They dress up as if they were monks and enter that city. The king of that kingdom had just lost his newborn firstborn son. And they say that the young woman was a witch, and that she was the one who had caused the child's death. And he crafts such a strategy, a set of arguments so persuasive, that the king ends up convinced of it. They tear the young woman from her parents' arms, tie her to a tree to keep her there, to be devoured by wild beasts. When this happens, the prince and his advisor go there, free her, take her with them, and she marries the prince, and they lived happily ever after. However, due to the pain of seeing their daughter exposed in such a way, the young woman's father and mother die of anguish and suffering. They die of grief, unable to bear witnessing their daughter's fate. The specter tells the story and turns to the king, asking who is to blame for the death of this father and mother. Which character in the story is responsible for her death? The king pauses, thinks, reflects, and comes to a conclusion. He knew that he knew. He couldn't avoid saying it, otherwise his head would explode. Then he says, "Look, the one responsible for this story, for these two deaths is the king. You can't blame the young couple, the two young people who were in love, because passion blinded them. They couldn't have done more than they did. You can't blame the advisor, because his duty to protect the prince prevailed over any other reason. He was fulfilling what he was prepared for. Now, the king, being there as king, had the obligation to be more attentive to every stranger who entered his kingdom, to know who he was, where he came from. Do not trust so easily in what they tell him. In other words, the one to blame for all this drama that victimized the couple was the responsibility, the recklessness of the king." The specter, upon hearing this, vanishes, returning to the tree. The king returns, retracing all the steps he had taken. Finds the corpse hanging from the tree, climbs up, cuts it down, places the corpse on his back, and starts walking again. Here comes the second story. And the second story is about three Brahmins who lived with the Brahmin master. And this master had a beautiful daughter, and the three young Brahmins wished to marry her. And so the father hesitated to give her in marriage to one of them, because he knew the other two would be very disappointed. And the three, in their deep love for the young woman, one day the young woman falls ill and dies. One of the young Brahmins, after the funeral pyre had been built and the body had been burned, one of the young Brahmins took the bones from the pyre and decided to wash them in the river Ganges, in honor of his love and the beauty of that young woman, in the sacred waters of the Ganges River. The other young man decided to become a wanderer, trying to find an answer to it in the world. And the third young man stayed there, lying on the ashes, unwilling to leave, not a minute away from what had been the body of his beloved. Well, it so happens that this young man who had become a wanderer, he encounters a wizard who had a book that described how to bring a body back from death, even if it had been cremated, of a child who had just died. He sees that, takes the book with the spell, with the magic, and brings it to the place where the young woman had died. At that moment, the young man arrives with the bones washed in the Ganges. They reassemble the skeleton over those ashes, and the first young man reads the incantation, and it immediately takes effect. The body of the young woman rises from those bones, from those ashes, and she stands once more, as beautiful as she always was. As soon as this happens, the fight starts again, because all three believe they have the right to marry her. One because he discovered the incantation, the other because he washed the bones in the Ganges, and the other because he never left the ashes of his beloved for even a minute. And the specter, concluding the story, turns to the king and asks whom she should marry. The king, once again, thinks and says the following. Well, the young man who gave her life, who discovered the magic through which he could bring her back to life, he behaves like a father. The young man who paid tribute to her bones, so that she would not be forgotten, behaves like a son. But that young man who lay on her ashes and didn't leave for even a minute, he behaves like a companion. He is connected to her side for life. Therefore, he played the role of a husband, he behaved like a husband. Upon hearing this answer, once again the specter vanishes, taking the body back with him to the tree. This brings the king back again. He takes the body once more and sets off on his way. The specter begins to tell another story. And then he begins to narrate the story of a young woman who was walking at a certain moment through a field, a devastated field, and she encounters a thief. He was almost dying, had been impaled, alive, and was there, nearly agonizing. He says to her, "Look, marry me now, because I will leave all my riches to you. And the child you have, even if it's by another man, will be my child." She agrees, and they get married right there. He tells her where the cave is, where he kept all the treasure he had stolen. And this child, then, is raised in complete luxury, in all falsehood, that is to say, the child had not yet been born. She marries the young Brahmin, who gives a large dowry for their marriage, and a child is born who is raised in complete luxury. With all the comfort, thanks to the thief's money, a certain moment arrives. Her husband dies, and the newborn son of the king had also passed away. She decides to take this child that had been born and wrap it in cloaks. She places several gold coins and sets them at the doors of the king's castle. He has a dream that tells him to do this. At the same time, the king had dreamed that another child would appear and that he should raise Cruz y Souza as his own son. The king takes this child and raises him as if he were his own son. Some time later, this child, now grown into an adult, had the duty to go to a well, as was the tradition, and pay homage to his father. But when he goes to this well to do what was expected, pay homage to his deceased father, offer tributes to his deceased father, from within this magical well, not just one father's hand emerges, but 3 hands. The hand of the thief, the hand of the Brahmin who gave him his body, and the hand of the king who raised him. And then the spectre asks the king, to which of these 3 hands should he offer the tributes of a father? The king thinks and also finds an answer and says, "Look. The Brahmin who gave him life did so as a reward, was bought with the mother's dowry. The king who raised him did so out of longing, out of sadness, because he truly wanted his own son back. The only one who gave everything he had, without expecting anything in return, which is the role of a father, was the thief. He gave everything he had so that this child could have a dignified upbringing. And it is inherent in the role of a father, to give everything you have without any expectation of return. Therefore, it is the thief's hand where he should place his offering." Once again, the spectre, surprised by such wisdom, scoffs and returns to the tree. And so it goes, and another story is told. It is said that there was a couple who were walking in a certain direction, and along with them was a friend, the husband, his friend, and the wife. They passed by along the way, by a temple, the goddess Kali, who is a very powerful deity in Indian mythology, closely associated with death. And the husband asked for permission to enter this sanctuary of Kali. But there, he was so impressed, so devotional, that he ended up cutting off his own head as an offering. As the husband was taking too long, his friend went inside to see what was happening. When he sees what had happened, following his friend's example, he also cuts off his head as an offering to Kali. When the wife enters and sees that disaster, she covers her eyes and leaves to hang herself and end her life as well. When the goddess Kali calls her and says that she put the heads in the lucares, the neck of each one, and she would restore both to life. But the wife, in all her anxiety, places her husband's head on the friend's body, the friend's head on the husband's body, and both come back to life. And then the spectre asks the king once again, which of these 2 bodies is her husband? Whom should she serve as her husband? The one who has the husband's head, or the one who has the husband's body? And once again, the king thinks for a moment and gives the answer, certainly, the one who has the husband's head. It is the head that possesses the attributes of discernment, compassion, and values. It is the head that governs the body. So it is this head that is her true husband. Regardless of the body, it is to him that she is united. She should become his wife. The spectre, as usual, does the same thing. He returns to the tree, and this was a long time ago. The king going back and forth altogether. There are 24 stories. Zimmer doesn't reveal all these stories to us, which is a shame. You might think, wow, but this story is something else. But these stories are extremely sacred, intelligent, and it's a privilege for us to be able to know them. But Zimmer, due to the sheer length of the book, summarizes these stories. So, 24 stories are told. But the last one, the king was not able to reveal the outcome. The specter tells him the following. There was a hunter who lived in a tribe of hunters, and he was one of the leaders of that tribe, almost like a king. And he had become a widower. One fine day, he walks with his young son through the forest and sees footprints on the ground. Delicate footprints of two women, one slightly larger and one slightly smaller. And he says, by the elegance with which they walk, by the lightness of their steps, it must be a queen, a princess. We will go look for them, and if we find them, I, the father, will marry the queen, and you, my son, will marry the princess. The two of them crouch down, place their hands over the footprints, and make a pact. That the king would marry the owner of the larger footprint and the son with the smaller footprint. And so they set out in search of those women and indeed find a queen and a princess. The husband had died. The kingdom had been devastated, and they were fleeing quite frightened. But there was a detail that was completely unpredictable. The larger footprint belonged to the daughter and the smaller one to the mother, the queen. Since they had made a pact, and the word is sacred within this tradition, they couldn't go back on it. The father Cruz y Souza with the princess, and the son Cruz y Souza with the queen, fulfilling what had been agreed upon. From these two marriages, children were born, one child from each couple. And the specter turns to the king and says, tell me the relationship these children have with all the characters in the story. The king is struck by this. This is something. These children are siblings, they are parents, they are everything, with incredibly complicated family relations. How do you establish that? An unusual situation, and the king pauses and becomes thoughtful. And the specter says, all right, this is the last story. He doesn't find an answer to this last story. He remains there, reflective. The specter says, all right, this is the last story. I will leave this body so that you can take it in the direction of the arrow, which awaits you. Now, I'm going to tell you something. This arrow is a wizard. He is preparing a magic circle within which he intends to place this body. And he will perform an invocation that will force me to occupy this body. And then he will ask you to kneel and touch your forehead to the ground in reverence to me, performing a kind of ritual as if I were a god. When you do that, king, he intends to cut off your head. To prevent this from happening, and the power of your blood will further enhance the dark powers of this wizard. You will say the following. As a king, I am not accustomed to showing such reverence to anyone. I don't know how to do it. You are right. Do it first so I can see. When he demonstrates how to do it, you cut off this man's head. It's the only way to escape this trap. The king, thoughtful, listens to all of this. He goes there, and exactly what the specter had said happens. The wizard had completed his macabre magic circle. Wash the corpse, place it at the center of the circle, and summon the specter to inhabit that corpse. As if it were a religious ritual, as if there were a god present. And he asks the king to bow before that corpse. And the king says exactly what had been advised. When the arrow bends, he cuts off your head, removes your heart, and places both as an offering to that body. To that specter that is there. The specter then frees itself, tells him that he had achieved enough self-control, enough wisdom to now be a truly great king, and that, even when he was no longer in this world, in another world, he would continue to reign, because he had found what reigns within him. He asks if he has any requests, and the king makes a rather curious one, given that he could ask for anything, that there was a spiritual being there. He simply asks that these 25 stories never be forgotten by anyone, that they be eternally told, along with my own story. This is interesting because it reminds us of Homer when he prays to the Muses in the Odyssey. Ensure that this song remains alive in all its multiple meanings, as if this song held a great secret that humanity must not lose. The spirit agrees to this, and as soon as he withdraws, the god Shiva himself appears, who is also a god associated with renewal, to destruction and rebirth. Shiva Natraja is the one who dances upon what has already been used by the universe. The past, dismantle this, renews. Shiva Natraja appears before him and tells him of the great achievement, the great king he has become. He hands him a sword, invincible, very similar to King Arthur's Excalibur, which is nothing more than a seal of the willpower the king has achieved, and tells him to go, return to his land, where he will become a great king. That's what the king does. He returns to his kingdom, rules with great justice, with great wisdom throughout his life, never again wasting any opportunity to find jewels in his life. And this is the story, which is considered a true story. Seema is going to propose a series of meanings that are quite interesting. I would like to go over everything with you from the beginning. The first thing we can think about is these fruits that were given to the king. Imagine every day a fruit that inside it holds a jewel. Life does this to you every day. With us, when dawn breaks, when a new day comes, a new opportunity for life. It's a fruit that it gives you. It's a new opportunity for nourishment. It's a new opportunity to find a treasure there. And we, so inattentive, we toss these fruits aside, we waste our days. In a superficial way, in an irresponsible way, we throw away the fruits of life. One fine day, when we least expect it, it jumps on us. This is an important part. All the characters in this story, as they say in classical tradition, are not external characters. They are aspects of the king, positioned on the outside. Everything that exists, there are aspects of the king himself. Then, one day, a little monkey enters the throne room. What is this? A playful little monkey, curious, wanting to try things out. This playful and childlike aspect, that certain child, which never completely dies within us. That day, when we cast aside a bit of our inertia, all our routine, and we go to the garden, and we play at looking at nature. We play at listening to the song of a bird, and suddenly, in those things that seem trivial, we discover a jewel. We discover there an exceptional value. And this little monkey is our playful and childlike aspect. When we realize that life is giving us jewels, we look back and assume there are a number of jewels we've tossed aside, that we gave no importance to, and we think about how to reclaim them. Reclaim them from this past of inattentiveness, this past of superficiality, which has become just a shadowy memory. And we head towards the night. We leave the protected, illuminated day, where we live worshiping our own personality, and we head into the night. From the things we left behind, from the things we didn't understand deeply, we descend into this shadowy terrain. And there, this wizard will guide us to go. To a place where a corpse is hanging from a tree, the corpse of a criminal. This king is on a journey. He is still an apprentice king. He will only become a king at the end of the story. He is actually heading towards his own past, which, for some reason, he condemned to darkness, like a criminal, as if everything that happened in the past was laden with guilt, mistakes, traumas, not worth remembering. He goes towards his past and tries to bring it back to learn from it. When he does this, a voice begins to speak to him, to guide him, so that he may successfully complete his mission. This voice is nothing more than the voice of our inner self, our essence, our higher self, which begins in a challenging way, posing challenges so that this king can assimilate lessons from life, from the life of all human beings. These 25 stories are episodes from the life of every human being. As he assimilates, discerns, and extracts the content from each of them, his past becomes increasingly lighter to carry, easier to bear. Until he understands all the aspects of what the past wanted to teach him, he has to retrace his steps and start over. Each story will reveal something about him, indeed. So, if we go back to the first story, we'll see that the first story is about the two young men and the lady. That lady who? She makes signs, and the prince follows her with the advisor. If you imagine, the king's response there was completely unexpected. Of course, remember, I'm not giving a definitive explanation. It's a possibility, within what Zimmer proposes and some other observations of mine. It's a possibility. This story might be happening inside the man, or it might be happening outside, but it's an element that must be assimilated. This story shows various characters. Let's say it's an external situation, where this prince, for example, could eternally blame himself for not having saved the lives of this father and mother for the suffering he caused. As if, at that moment, his discernment looked at his past in a broader way, so that he could forgive himself, find his share of guilt. But he realized that this was a larger setting, that at that moment he had reached the limit of his possibilities. And if there was someone who made a mistake, perhaps it was the one responsible for this scenario. His responsibility was very small, still according to his conscience. He was this little prince who sought the lady. He still wasn't able to see to what level of consequences his boundless passion could lead, to what level of suffering, but there was a king who commanded the scene, who orchestrated this ceremony, who saw the limits of each person, the flaws of one, the passion of another, the blindness of another, and who was negligent in managing all these factors. It doesn't make sense, within a larger framework, to punish just one party. This is like revisiting the past to grant forgiveness to oneself for the harm caused, in which he played a part, but was not the sole owner. He encounters a tapestry of intricate causes, where, at that moment, his ignorance was the best he had. His passions were the best he had, but others, with more resources, also failed. Then comes the second story, which is the story of the three Brahmins and the lady. He, as the king, needed to understand the role of each one within nature. He needed to understand the role of the father, who is the young man that discovers the secret, the magic key to bring the young woman to life. He needed to understand the role of the son who washes the bones in the Ganges. He needed to understand the role of the husband, the one who never abandons the other and walks with her, even in the greatest adversities. He has to establish these roles within his kingdom, which he governs. And he, as a king, is also a father. He can never forget that, through him, people see life. Because a father is not just the one who gives physical life, provides motivation, delivers justice, offers guidance. He must take his place within society and help everyone find their role. You don't need to be a king of a particular people to do this. Someone who leads a family, someone who leads a work group, must know how to find their role and help everyone position themselves. Therefore, understanding all the roles within a human community to harmonize them all. He learns this. It was a secret that, as a king, he probably hadn't learned yet. In the third story, which is coming, the son with the three fathers, he will realize this idea that the true father, just like the true king, has a one-way path in his love. He expects nothing in return. When is any compensation expected? Wanting to be loved, wanting to be valued, wanting to be considered, what he does is an act of selfishness, a manipulation. Love justifies itself. This is very similar to the idea of platonic love, which speaks precisely of this one-way love. Unique. A true father is the one who gives all the best he has, wanting only one thing, the well-being of his child. He wants nothing for himself. He gives his best for the well-being of that new creature coming into life. And this father, even though limited, even though a thief, knew how to have the generosity to give everything he had to a child, without any expectation of recognition. He, as a king, had to learn what he needed to do with those children he led. This relationship of generosity and giving. And this story will help him further mature this aspect of his obligations. That also exists within a family, within a work group, and even in the way we conduct ourselves. Because the first being we educate and lead is ourselves. From this, we can educate and lead others. The next story is about the inverted heads. The story of the swapped heads is actually quite an interesting element, if you notice. This husband, who enters the temple of Kali and cuts off his head in devotion to the goddess, the friend who arrives and does the same thing, represents the man who, in the face of something that, for him, holds a sacred value, which could be a religious value. It could be a political value. It could be an artistic value, scientific, anything that becomes a kind of fanaticism. He loses his head because of it, and this sacred thing, if real, if it could speak to him, the first thing it would say is, keep your head in place. In other words, don't go beyond the limits of common sense. Keep your head in place. Let the head command the body. If there is something sacred that stands before man, it wants him to know how to conduct himself without excesses. That the goddess Kali advises and puts the head back in place. It's a bit like what the philosopher Epictetus used to say, protect your reason and it will protect you. The goddess Kali restores the lucidity of these men, so they learn the limits of devotion and fanaticism. In a historical moment like ours, where everything generates a kind of fanaticism, where we do not preserve our common sense, we don't keep our heads in place. This is a very special lesson. The sacred tells us that the best way to relate to me is by remaining human, with your head in place. Beyond the explanation that Zimmer inherits, which logically states that the head rules over the body and is the root of identity. The next story, he will say that it's the story of the father and son, hunters. It's very interesting because notice that when the father and son see the footprints on the ground, the larger footprint, they assume, belongs to the queen and the smaller one to the princess. But what they don't realize is that the queen had a much greater maturity than the princess. She had achieved a much higher level of nobility, and that the spiritual treads lightly in the world. The more spiritual one is, the lighter the touch on the material world. It's a delicate touch seeking wisdom in the world. She doesn't rely on the material, she simply touches it. Logically, then, a queen would be wiser and have a gentler touch on the world. Material. This is the first element they fail to see. And the second element, as Zimmer himself says, is realizing that all human beings are simultaneously one thing and another. We are parents, we are siblings. At times, we can be parents to our parents, and sometimes children to our siblings. All the roles. Because the roles are not only on the physical plane, they exist on the psychological, moral, spiritual plane. All roles can be experienced between two human beings, in a single lifetime. At the end of life, generally, we become parents to our parents. At a certain point, we are children, sometimes we are children to our siblings, sometimes we are their parents. Various roles a single human being can fulfill during their lifetime. We are a blend of all the universe's potentialities. We are dual. And another interesting element we could also notice here is that, through these multiple kinship relationships on all levels, in a certain way, we can see that all of humanity has a strong bond of kinship, both concrete and potential. If we revealed this possibility, there would be no more selfishness, there would be no more violence. Because we would discover in everyone around us our great family. This is somewhat what Plato aims for in his dialogue, The Republic, when he asks that the children of the guardians, as soon as they are born, be shuffled, so that all the guardians become parents to all those children, and these ties of what is mine and what is yours are dissolved. Because, he says, deep down, humanity is a family, and we must find ways to regain this perception. So that was the last story. And he returns, then, after having retrieved all the wisdom, all the jewels that were inside the fruit, all the wisdom of his past. He finds himself in the situation where his past is Socratic, is placed at the center of a sacred circle and is Socratic. In other words, he begins to respect the past. He redeems his guilt. It is no longer a criminal past. He retrieves the things he hadn't learned. He retrieves the solidarity he hadn't achieved. He retrieves the perceptions that were necessary to live the future. In other words, his past begins to have meaning. As the anthropologist Mircea Eliade, the sacred is the function of giving meaning. He makes peace. He Socraticizes his past by accepting to learn from it. But then this spirit, which is this ascetic, a somber spirit, which is also an aspect of him, doesn't simply want to justify the past, wants to worship the past, wants him to bow down and worship the past, to be trapped by it. And this, the king can no longer accept. He heard a much deeper voice. He has already synthesized the experience of the past and now needs to move forward. So, he silences that inner voice that wants to bind him to the past. He cuts off its head and its heart, and he places it at the feet of this spirit, which, deep down, is his own spirit. He asks for memory, that humanity never forgets these teachings. And Shiva himself, God himself, as a representation of his inner deity, tells him that he is now a king. He is given the sword he so rightfully deserved, which represents his will. Gives him his rightful role as king and removes from him the veils of ignorance. And this king suddenly begins to see deeply that he had a divine essence within himself, that it was enough to recognize it, Socratic every moment of his life, but to walk decisively towards the future without fear. The essence of all times was with him. The essence of all times walks with us when we accept to learn from all times, the winters and summers of existence. We simply synthesize all time into an eternal present. And this king returns and becomes a great king, going down in history as a wise king. And he must have continued, even after life, to reign with wisdom over himself. And as this spectre says, anyone who, at a certain moment, reads these stories with devotion will gain power over circumstances. These stories will forever be sacred. This is a very profound story, of multiple meanings, which I ask you to reflect upon. Remember that I have no intention of having exhausted all meanings. There is an ancient tradition that speaks of very important things for humanity. I ask that you reflect, as a story as beautiful as this one deserves.